the Battle of Cannae. And really what we're trying to demonstrate for you today is what we call the double envelopment. Colonel Broyles really talked about kind of like the different concepts that have been repeated history after history. And this is an ancient battle between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And so we really want to spend some time today and kind of explain what happened in this and what a double envelopment is and how effective it can be. So, yeah. So we'll get started real quick. So just to kind of paint the picture for you guys. So this battle happens near the boot of Italy, kind of like the southeastern corner. So prior to that, you had Hannibal's army came over the Alps, he made a decisive victory, and then he started coming down the eastern side of Rome at that point, Italy, and pushed his way all the way down here until he got to the town of Cannae. And it was at this point in time that Rome, they had lost a huge portion of their army, and so they did this massive conscription and brought a huge force. It almost outnumbered the Carthaginians, about 2-1, really close to that. And so that's kind of what we have today. So to kind of really paint the picture for you guys, the forces up here on the northern side, these were the Romans, and right down here on the south were the Carthaginians. And so just to kind of give you a little more explanation. So the Romans had two camps that they had on the other side of the river, and the Carthaginians had a camp on this hillside on the other side of the river. But really where the battle actually happened, it was formed between this river and then these set of hills. So it kind of forced them into this channel that they had to fight through. Yeah. And so we just want to spend a little bit of time to explain exactly how this fight happened.
Yeah, something interesting that you said that I didn't know that he had actually contributed. So the reason why that's important is because these guys don't have the history that these guys do. Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the Memorial Plane of War series, one of the things that that is one of the fundamental instincts of man is that comradeship, that self-sacrifice. Well, these guys are going to have it because they all know each other and they have a lot in common. They have a lot of history. They're knit together. That relationship side. Whereas with these guys, you have some really pipe swinging infantry in there, but then you got a bunch of randos that just scooped out and they throw in there, which is going to factor into later. I think is pretty important.
Exactly. So, yeah. And then another really key piece to kind of look at this is Hannibal really had some premier cavalry. So if you kind of look here, we did the little slashes to kind of indicate cavalry. So, the way they formed this battle up was the Romans, they didn't have as much cavalry because they lost a lot of it kind of in the previous fighting. And cavalry is inexpensive and it takes a lot of time to build up a cavalry force. So they didn't have as much as what Hannibal had for this fight. In most traditional fights you'll see in ancient warfare, they'll always kind of line up this way. We'll have these skirmisher lines up front with kind of light infantry. They're maybe wearing a leather jerkin and have spears and something kind of throw and just kind of try to disrupt and dissuade the oncoming attack. And usually behind those skirmisher lines, they'll always line up with more heavy infantry. So you have shields and a little bit maybe some heavier armor and so forth. So this is kind of the way they lined it up. And if you notice something different though, Hannibal, was his prized infantry, his most elite and veteran guys. And he actually hid them in the rear. So to kind of show you, this was like a grassy plain, this whole area. So you imagine kind of little slightly rolling hills, a little bit of undulation, not too bad. But this used to be farmy kind of area. And so they were hiding, these folks were hiding kind of just in the dirt. They were just keeping themselves low to the ground so that way they weren't seen by the Romans as they were advancing. So.
Right. No, yeah, I think it's interesting on 2 points. One, so Fuller will say that the art of generalship is in originality. This is very, very original. No one had probably done this before that I'm aware of. And then the way he hides him and masks him with does stuff is pretty impactful. And then Sun Tzu would also echo the same thing, that all warfare is deception. Well, that's what he's doing. He's saying this is all I got, and then just come find out he's got these vipers in the back.
Exactly. Exactly. So as we see this battle progress, we'll kind of talk about it in just a moment here. But the big thing is we talk about something in the Dark Rifles called the decisive point. Yeah. And one of our beliefs is that the commander, for whatever echelon, he needs to be at the decisive point. And so in this battle, you'll find that Hannibal, the commander for the Carthaginians, he positioned himself right here in the center lines. This is where Hannibal was at for the entire duration of the fight. He wasn't with his cavalry. He wasn't with his elite infantry. He was at the point where he needed to be. Right. So, but anyways, without further ado, I think we get started and just talk about it?
Yeah.
All right. So the way this battle kind of worked is the first thing that happened is, they all lined up, kind of almost very patriotic of each other to get themselves lined up. But the very first thing is the Romans, they felt they had a numeric superiority, which they did. They had more forces. But they also were going to rely on a kind of tried and true tactic that had worked for them in the past. And that was relying on the heavy armaments of their heavy infantry. So you can kind of look at this right here. They had way more folks with heavy armaments. The large shields, the strips of metal plate armor, the gladius swords. So they had all of these guys that were just they pretty much technology, you could say, the folks that were on the other side.
Yeah, which is important. So like kind of go back to Fuller again, like you talk about the two different domains of fear. One of the domains of fear is in physicality, like actual stuff, and that comes down to equipment and training. And so like, whereas that they're really, really strong in equipment, now that we know they have a lot of conscripts, not that great on training, besides their heavy infantry is in the center. So that's just kind of a little added idea there for you.
Exactly. So like, the Roman plan was they were going to basically start marching themselves just directly into this, and they were just going to push through and break the line to cause a rout, and that's when they were going to basically win that fight. They're going to just hack down and try to kill as many Carthaginians and their allies as they could as they're running away. So that was the Roman battle plan.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting when you juxtapose the two different concepts of what's going to happen. They're both canalized. They both have like limited frontage, right? They're going to sit there and do this one for one kind of thing, right? The difference is that these guys think that, well, we just have a lot of dudes. We'll just keep on throwing dudes at this stuff and then we'll eventually win. Whereas he's actually thought through this and been like, that's not going to work. So I'm going to set up this whole shenanigan back here to actually exploit their silliness.
Exactly. So as this battle starts, the very first couple things that happen, there's really two things that happen. These skirmishers, they get out front, and imagine these guys with some shields, little rocks, or not shields, pardon me, spears, and they kind of get up there and they start chucking spears at the other guys, trying to slow their advance so they can kind of gauge what's happening. And as that's happening, the very next thing that you kind of see is that the Carthaginians, he starts to push out his line. He kind of bulges it a little bit like this. Right. So it kind of creates this bulge, and he forces all of his folks to kind of come up here and kind of make a line. So it kind of forces the Romans to kind of
focuses them on one spot.
Exactly, kind of wash over them. And this is right here was where Hannibal himself was at. Now, as he's kind of positioning his forces, he takes his lead general, I forgot his name. Anyways, his lead general comes up here and he starts skirmishing with this cavalry. Now, he outnumbered this flank about 2-1. And as this fight's progressing, he finds himself pushing this cavalry further back. And they kind of start bounding back. Now this infantry, they're not too worried about it. They just continue to push forward until they get to this point up here. But what ends up happening is these guys, these Carthaginian cavalry, they end up just decimating that whole line of the whole
Roman
cavalry. And so, but the other thing that's interesting is that the Carthaginians, they left their other cavalry just positioned on the corner because they had this hill they had to worry about, and it wasn't quite part of his battle plan.
Yeah, I think I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Hannibal's right here at the decisive point, which is really key because that's going to have the most casualties. Like the worst part of this whole fight is right there on the tip of there, and that's where he's at, which is kind of a lesson in leadership, in and of itself. Because where's the Roman leader? Like we don't even really know or care, but we do know where he was at. Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, if I remember right, the Roman leader kind of positioned himself kind of near the back so he could kind of negotiate his forces and figure it out. But Hannibal, he was maybe like the third dude back from the front, or the fourth dude back from the front. He's got like one or two guys in front of him, but he's right up there on the line. So you can see what's going on.
You think about the classic example of Charles de Gaulle's picture over a map versus Rommel's picture, like dirty with a bunch of binoculars. So Rommel's a much more dynamic leader, a much more effective leader. Why? Because that's where he was at the whole time.
Exactly. So as this is kind of progressing, the Romans, they eventually come up. The skirmishers, they kind of fall back in line with everybody else, and you eventually have these Roman heavy infantry colliding directly with this Carthaginian heavy infantry. And one of the concepts of warfare is like forces, they kind of want to come together, right?
Yeah, it's two biggest dudes on the block always want to fight each other, and that's what's happening here.
Yeah, and so they it's like a magnet. They just come together, and they can't help themselves but doing it. And so as that's happening, these cavalry right here, they start engaging with the Numidian cavalry. And these guys, think of them maybe more as like an archer kind of like distance kind of cavalry. So they're like continually harassing them and kind of keeping them at bay, keeping them from being able to flank them or anything like that. So their whole goal is to kind of hold this cavalry back and not let them push. Our board updated. Yeah, so kind of want to show like the progression of that. So in that last one, we kind of showed like the Romans, they were getting everything they wanted to get. They wanted to push themselves and kind of break through. And the Carthaginians, like no joke, they were having a struggle with this.
Right. I think it's really interesting that they used the mental model that the Romans had against them. That they gave them exactly what they wanted. They're like, oh yeah, it's working. And all of a sudden it wasn't working.
And so like if you can kind of start to see right here, so if imagine for a second, you have all of these all these Romans pushing through. They feel like they've made success. But just imagine for a second, all these dudes right here, they don't know they're there.
Right.
So like from the Roman perspective, like you just broke through some lines right here. You still have a little bit of like skirmishing going on with some like rogue units, little, you know,
right.
like, you know, squad or platoon on platoon fights happening back here. But that's just minutia at this point,
right.
right? For them, they're starting to push through, and like they're almost about to break this line is what they see is happening.
Well, that's what they think is happening.
Yeah, that's what they think is happening. But here's what's going on like in the whole picture, right? So what ends up happening is, you know, Hasdrubal, he was defeat this cavalry up here.
Right.
So he's a little exhausted, but you know, he just ran the horses ragged, he just got a huge fight.
Yep.
So he starts making his way, you know, he recovers, he reorganizes everything, and he starts making his charge down here to take out this other cavalry.
Right.
Now these guys, they realize they're about to be outnumbered like 3 or 4 to 1 against cavalry that are really good. Yeah, way better. Like,
and way experienced.
Way more experienced.
Yeah.
So he starts making his charge, and these guys see that like, oh,
Nope.
we're out. Like, I'm getting out of here.
Right.
So they eventually make for this gap, and as soon as that happened, that's when Hannibal, like, he's got it.
Yeah, right.
He knows he's got him exactly where he wants him. So he's got this infantry, his best veteran infantry in hiding. They're about to come out of hiding. His cavalry's coming back. He scares these guys away. And what's the next thing that his general knows to do?
Close the gap.
Close the gap. So he makes his move right to here.
Yeah.
And he brings his cavalry right in there. And as soon as that happens, he's got all these infantry, they pop up.
And then you go to a fight.
And they close in.
Yep.
And so like, just imagine for a second, all of a sudden you think you're about to win this fight.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, you're surrounded on all sides.
Yeah, there's so many things that like you talk about right there. Like you have that whole idea where we're talking about frontage. That like you could have a gazillion guys in here, but if they can only get like shoulder to shoulder for so much, you can only really fight so many guys at one period of time. And the guys on the exterior can just expand out or do whatever they want. So they're going to have a lot more lethality than the guys on the inside. And then you have the other idea that like also now you have like a massive morale collapse, you know, because one of the things that like that your people need to know is that like they're going to be protected, they're going to be able to make it through. Somebody like like they're going to be able to fight and get to this point where they're going to be able to rest and stuff. Yeah. Now all of a sudden that's all like up in the air, like question, because they're like, we may not get out of here. And once that that tipping scale between like moral the moral force and fear starts to tip, well now it's on this side and they're just straight panic, and that means that nothing intelligent is happening. There's just straight chaos.
Exactly. And so like these guys, they come in to fill in the gap, and like it's just what ends up happening is like if you're kind of familiar with like the concept of interior and exterior lines, right? So like it's just a circle, right? Like if you ever draw like a circumference or whatever on a circle, like you've got more area, so more swords, right? Like you've got more swords swinging on these insides. You might have 1,000 swords in the middle here, but they're all useless.
Yeah.
You've made them, you've dislocated them. Yeah. Is what's basically happening.
So like it reminded me of like there's a game I used to play whenever I was like a teenager, right? I was 13, 14, we get on dial-up internet and play Red Alert, right? Yeah. Okay, well so the whole deal was like you did these big tank battles. Well, I had a guy who used to routinely beat me, and I was too dumb to figure out how I was losing. But what he would do is like I would build 1,000 tanks. He'd build like maybe 50 tanks. But he'd find a gap like this. He would put his 5 or 6 tanks out there, and there's one would blow up. He'd plug another gap. And my dudes were coming up, and they're just shooting all of this area, just completely like wiping me out. And that's exactly what's happening here. Is that like he's got on the exterior, you have so much more space to be able to bring so many more weapons to bear on like one guy. Whereas that one guy, you have like 1,000 dudes, but he can't get up there to fight because you're in his way. And so that's what's happening.
Yeah. And so like the way this battle wraps up is the morale of these forces right here, it just takes a nosedive immediately, right? So at this point, Hannibal, he's basically won like the moral plane. Like he's basically
won. Just waiting to die.
So like the will to fight just dramatically decreases, right? You've got a bunch of conscripts who their first thought was like, I'm hoping I make it out of this so I can go home to my farm field.
Get back to the barley.
Exactly, right? And all of a sudden, all those dreams are dashed.
Yeah, right.
And the next thing that happens is his forces, they just start hacking and hacking and hacking. And this circle, it just starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller as all of these guys come in. And it was said like this battle was just super bloody, extremely bloody, like just bodies stacked on stacked. And people were like trying to like kill themselves because they were just so fearful of like what was about to happen to them. And there's just no way to get out of it. So that right there is just kind of like the Battle of Cannae that we kind of want to talk about, like this double envelopment, how when forces they collide, they want to like
stick together.
They want to stick together, and he used that to his advantage to just suck that whole force in.
Into a big envelopment.
Exactly. And so in a sense, like, even though he was outnumbered, he had more swords swinging on this outside.
Yeah.
Basically, it was like this guy on the inside he was fighting two or three dudes at a time.
Yeah, right.
He couldn't fight fast enough. So he was always getting stabbed or poked or whatever.
I think it's also like a really good case for mission orders, because you think about this guy up here, like he did his job, right? But he knows whether or not they had talked about, like, hey, look, this is what I want you to do. Because I mean, at this point, you've got a three-sided envelopment on there. Like, it's, you know, he's pretty well set. But he knows, like, in order to win, we need to, like, just decimate these guys. And he looks back and sees a hole and then takes the initiative to actually go and plug that hole. Now, whether that was the plan or he just wanted to do it, either way, it's a pretty solid case for mission orders, because he doesn't have, like, a cell phone. He's not texting like, hey, man, like, you know, he looks back and sees it and he knows what he needs to do and goes and does it.
Yeah. And I think that kind of just goes to talk about, like, what we're trying to do with the Dark Hours, like, build those mental models. So that way, when you see something like that, you don't have to call your boss up and ask for permission or ask for guidance. You just know, like, oh, I've seen this work in the past. Yeah. I know what the right answer is.
Yeah, you have, like, kind of like a playbook that you can flip through, but oh yeah, this is that thing again. Okay,
exactly.
Cool, let's go do it.
Exactly. So I think that's the Battle of Cannae, and that's what we kind of wanted to get you guys to understand, like, what a double envelopment is, and kind of how it looks, and, like, what forces are going into making it.
I think you would take from this, as you learn this, is the Battle of Cannae. It's going to be, this thing happened in like 216 BC. Generals throughout history will study this, and they're going to try and rerun it over and over and recreate it.
Yeah.
They're going to recreate it over and over and over, because to them, this is the ultimate battle, right? The decisive battle. And you'll see a lot of, throughout history, everyone's trying to create this decisive battle. Nobody wants a long, drawn-out war, right? That saps the nation's treasure, saps the nation's generations, right? Everybody wants to win in one big moment. Win it all. They're going to try and recreate it and recreate it and recreate it. One good example is the Schlieffen Plan, leading up to World War I, 1914. The Schlieffen Plan is von Schlieffen's going to write an actual book, Cannae.
Right.
And he's going to, hypothesize that the way they're going to beat the French in one big battle is to recreate this battle. And the things, they're all the different ideas that will come from this. For example, the Russians will come up with their idea. They'll always want to fight a meeting engagement, because their whole idea, if I may, is with a meeting engagement, one force is moving this way, one force is moving this way. If this is the Russians, they will at some point collide. And knowing that two forces here will want to push on each other, once they make this collision, these two forces will continue to want to collide, and almost like a jiu-jitsu hold, they'll hold it, and the rear group keeps moving, and they'll swing around and attack like this, almost creating this very same thing. They call that a hammer and anvil. And there's others, example after example, of how this one idea. And I think the purpose we like to do this is you have to be a war fighter. You have to know this basic concept. You have to know this idea of how he set this up, how he lured them in, and he created this double envelopment, like you said. Because then, at any echelon, whether you're a squad leader, platoon leader, lieutenant general, this is one idea that is always enduring, and people will always try to recreate this if they can.
Over and over again.
Yeah.